Hello, this is the Kevin Stoda channel, and I welcome you for a chat on the porch. I've been doing chat readings lately, but today I'm going to share of my personal story a bit and try to combine that with some other stories I've been sharing to you about race, about trauma, about education, about experiences, about being an insider, and about being an outsider. I've done several of these readings from articles and magazines, but this time I'm going to focus on my story. If you have any questions or comments, please write them down. I'll check them later or as I see them today. I'm outside, so I might not see your question right away or your comment, but I'll try to shout out to you as things go along. Let me first preface this by indicating that recently our church has been asking big questions. Our church is very multicultural. We've got Hispanics, we've got whites, poor whites, poor Hispanics, rich Hispanics. We've got educated, less educated workers. We've got a great mix of people in our church. So the church has been asking in the wake of our brokenness, and by brokenness I mean what's led to protest and the violence that led to the protest and the systemic violence that led to those actions in the police force or in other facets of life, whether it's in the courtroom or in education. I'm going to take you back a little bit. Um, I was born in 1962. That was the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I grew up in the 60s and was cognizant, till eighth grade in a place called Genoa, Illinois, and that's in DeKalb County. Most of you know DeKalb corn. Uh, that's from there. Uh, and I think also the inventor of barbed wire is from there, DeKalb County. Make a long story short, though, um, I lived in a small town called Genoa, Illinois. It's a town my family, uh, um, I should say, my father's parents still lived, the Stoda family, and cousins lived relatively close. All but one family lived in the state of uh, Illinois on my dad's side of the family, so you could drive and see everybody. Um, in the 60s, this DeKalb County voted heavily for George Wallace for president. Um, Many towns in that city, that county, I suspect, were sundown towns or sundown counties. I'm a person in the city limits of the town, but one time in the 8 years we lived there. I lived there. Uh, we moved out in November of 2000. 1970. I do. I remember as a kid, I was probably 6 years old. I saw him, and I remember pointing at the black person with a group of my friends, just because I hadn't seen it before. I thought they would see it as amazing too. Um, so as I said, I'm not sure, but there is a history in the county to indicate that there was a lot of segregation within that county, and that's true for many northern states. That's why so many people voted for Wallace in '68. Uh, a lot of northern racism, and that's what the history of that part of the country indicates. Um, I will come back to Illinois later in my story. Let me check if there's any listeners. Okay. Uh, in 1970, as I said, in November, we moved from uh, Illinois to where my mother was from. My mother is from the southwestern part of Missouri. She was born in Sycamore, Illinois, which is definitely, I would say, definitely was a sundown town. And the county of Jasper, where Joplin is located, had several sundown towns, totally unintegrated. I think there's been probably an average of 1 to 4 black people in the town for 100 years. Um, And so it's in this area, that the people decided to support the southern states in the Civil War. It's in towns like this in southern Missouri where this was the case. Of course, Kansas City, where I'm living now, had a lot of people who supported the South. And to make a long story short, we moved west of Ferguson, Missouri, closer in St. Louis, St. Charles. We lived in Winsville, Missouri from 1970 to 1975. So this would be my fourth through seventh grade years. And it Winsville was at a high stress level. Integration in Missouri had just recently taken place. I wasn't really aware of how much that was the case in my time there because everything had been changed by about 1970. So we now had huge number of kids in school from Winsville and from all over the county because where there had been segregated schools before, were now integrated. I could walk to school, and on the way I would sometimes meet Harold Clark and some other students. And I will share about Harold and his friend David. It was December, because I had only been in school about 2 or 3 weeks in this new school setting. I didn't really have any friends. And suddenly I was targeted by Harold and David. I think they just wanted to tease and play around, but because I had never once been in a fight with anybody in my town in Genoa, Illinois, never, I didn't know how to respond. David, when the teacher was out of the room, told Harold to wrestle me or beat me up or something like that. So Harold attacked me in a wrestling type situation, and I didn't know what to do but to wrestle back. And I was on top of Harold as the teacher came back into the room. And they, all three of us got sent to the office. This is in fourth grade, 1970. And both David and Harold, by the way, were black. And as would be in those days, my family, came from the law and order, quote unquote, type of people. They took things seriously. So I didn't know how my parents would respond. Here I was in a fight in my first few weeks of school. We went to the principal's office, but he said come back the next day after we told our stories. In the meantime, Harold and David had told the principal that I called them niggers. Now, I didn't ever really use that word in my whole life. Because of the sensitivities of the time in the 60s, I didn't know any black people in the 60s. And by 70, it was clear that you weren't supposed to use the word. So I never would have called him that. As a matter of fact, I was more likely looking for friends or, seeing that my curiosity of how to make friends with people in the new city where I was at, or town, Winsville, Missouri, was more of my focus. As would have, but I was the only one of the three kids who got paddled. I got paddled by the principal 2 or 3, 4 times with a hard paddle. And in other words, I was the scapegoat for what happened that day. Now, this is what gets me. I was too embarrassed to tell my family what had happened. I was worried, things I couldn't control. Like, how would my dad respond? How would my mom? Would they side with me, or would they attack the principal or the teacher, or what? And I really didn't want to get into it. I just, didn't want to talk about it. I didn't even tell my brother, I think, until a few days later. We never told my parents growing up about it. Why? Well, if I was a genius, I probably would say that I fully made the decision to racial integration issues were at stake, and that what a couple young black kids did to me was a small price to pay for the changes that we were seeing in the community where people were supposed to be getting along with each other. in 1970. I should note that Wentzville, Missouri, is the birthplace of Chuck Berry, so the town has always had some racial history, but it was quite covered up by the time I got there in 1970. And actually, within a couple of months, Harold was a friend, and I didn't think anything about it. I never made him apologize for the event. It did stay at the back of my mind because I would not remember it all this time. But I am a forgiving person, and that's part of just who I am. Trauma or not, that's the kind of family and Christianity I was raised in churches and elsewhere. Harold would come over and play baseball with us in the Lutheran school grounds. And actually, Harold had gone to the Lutheran school. Later, he would go to the Catholic school across town where my dad and brother and I would go to church on Sundays, and I would take catechism. In short, Harold was having trouble at schools and behavior-wise, and I don't know if he had attention deficit or what, but he was smart up here, and he was very talented in sports, but he didn't seem to get along in school. I pray he's okay. And then David, the guy who'd instigated the fight, who teased Harold into the fight with me, was much taller. He was black, as I mentioned before. His mom was a second-grade teacher in the school. And again, that was probably one reason why I didn't fight them. I did tell the principal I didn't call him that N-word. But when he spanked me, I was probably thinking, no way I can get out of this. The mother's a second-grade teacher down the hall from the principal. In any case, David and I never got in trouble again. As a matter of fact, David's mom was the Cub Scout leader. And so by January, the very next year, January 71, we were in Cub Scouts together at the Woods family house, David's family's house, at least every other week. And we did things like go swimming together, or I think we watched part of the, or listened to part of the Frazier, the Frazier Ali fight that spring. I remember that we talked about it in Cub Scouts at that time in Wentzville, Missouri. Let me go back to Chuck Berry and his relationship to the town. He's always had the address of Wentzville. He built the Heights, the Wentzville Heights, was created by him, and it was initially an all-black community. So blacks who were getting a little bit more better jobs had built a community outside of St. Louis in the 1950s and early 60s. But by the 70s, it was an integrated community. And this is this town of Wentzville. And I think of Chuck Berry and how he was mistreated over the years. He was thrown in jail just for having affairs or sex with women of color, of non-color, whites. And so affectionately, we did buy his, 8-track tapes, and we listened to them growing up. Anything from My Ding-a-Ling to the others. Now, I want to make sure I got everything. Okay, so Harold and David and we got along after that. But I remember being the victim of what would be black ganging up on white. And I've never really understood why whites as a group in the United States, as a large group, many of them feel picked on by blacks and feel like if there was any black privilege, like was set up in the civil rights era to help blacks in school or to get college scholarships or whatever. I've never understood why people were so in taking that right or privilege away from them. And I felt like it was simply going up and looking at my family and the people I know that was just jealousy. For some reason, um, and I did not come from a wealthy family. My dad probably never made $26,000 a year in his whole life until after. And we came from that poor background, and the people from the Heights who we knew were from that poor, middle to lower. We pretended like we were middle class, but we were really lower middle if we were. And the same thing for my other friends in the neighborhoods near the school in Winsville. So I found grace. I could give grace. I could forgive people for doing things bad to me, but I don't figure out why other people can't, other white people, if they feel threatened by a person of color. On the other hand, I was quite educated already by the age of 8. We had books like Meet Martin MLK, Meet JFK, Meet RFK, Meet Gandhi. By the early 70s, these were in print and we read them. And we understood that people had to do protest and call for action and change against the wave. But I never understood why so many other people feel like everybody has to be treated 100% equal. But I did have this idea of equity. Everybody should be treated the same. And I felt like, for example, the use of that N-word over the years, that black people use it with each other, sometimes meaning brother, or putting other people down, or just teasing people, black people teasing black people and using the word. I felt like you're degrading yourself. And I felt like that your parents should have probably told you not to for that very reason. Like my parents would have told me not to degrade yourself. White people who call each other crackers, that's not a nice thing either. But people do. In any case, in 1975, our family left this more integrated or mixed community of Winsville, and we went to Sterling, Kansas. And Sterling, Kansas was interesting because there was an AME church, and that was the first time I ever saw one or noticed one in my life. My mother's a United Methodist minister, and there was an AME church in that town of Sterling, and that's the first time I said that they go to church separate from one another. I didn't really understand. Because I had gone to Catholic church up until then, and Catholics all went to the Catholic church, whether you're black or white. In any case, the separation of the churches was the first time in my life clear to me. As one of the football players in my high school team, his father was the head of the church, and his sister also went to the school and was in my brother's grade. And besides that, there was another family we knew in high school. We call them the Nichols. And I think Nichols, there was a girl in my sister's grade, and Jimmy Nichols was in my brother's grade too. So we had more intimate relationship with these people because we played football with them. And we saw them every day, and there was actually only 1 or 2 grades in every school level, unlike in Winsville where you had 8 to 10 different classes in each grade. There was only 1 or 2 grades throughout the school. In Sterling, even though the towns were almost of the same size at that time. What I wanted to say is I happened to be in the hospital in my junior year. It was in November, and I was just in the hospital for 2 days. Something happened. I hit my head, and they had to do EKGs and EEGs and check me out. And that was the very day that Skip Nichols, the father of Jimmy, was brought to that hospital. We all knew Skip. He was a huge black man in Sterling, and he'd lived there almost his entire life, except for the years apparently when he'd gone to play basketball with the Harlem Globetrotters, or maybe serve in the military, as far as I know. Skip had played with the Harlem Globetrotters, and I remember one day in school reading about him in the newspaper, because they showed a story from 40 years earlier in the paper. In a high school game, Skip had jumped had done a jump ball, and he knocked the ball right into the basket. And he's the only person I ever know to have done that. And so we knew him around town. His wife and children were in our school, and I think Skip had been brought to the hospital the same day. Skip is a big, strong-looking man, and he had something wrong with him, but the doctors didn't know what. Okay, 2 days later, Skip was dead. I was out of the hospital, and Skip was dead. And that was the first time I experienced the idea that was in the back of my mind that they would have probably treated Skip better at the hospital and done a better job of finding out what was wrong with him if he wasn't black. That hospital was in Lyons, Kansas, just 8 miles north of Sterling. Apparently, he died of gangrene. What had happened? His appendix had burst, probably Saturday. And on Sunday, he was in the hospital, and that's when I saw him, and he passed away. I feel that many black people have lost their parents due to such inaction at hospitals over the last hundreds of years. This needs to stop, America. And if we talk about our health crisis and the pandemic today, we need to think about this. I saw a similar sort of activity, not with just black people, but with other outsiders in Great Bend a few years later when I was teaching out in Great Bend. A woman who I knew from the gym and sports center, they had a swimming pool there, the community rec center, that I knew she, from these experiences there and from phone calls I had from her over the years, that she had not developed quite right. She was mentally younger than her age, but apparently she'd had a child. Because in spring of 1991, her daughter came to me with close to tears in her eyes at the high school where I was teaching. And she said her mother died in the hospital. And I said, how? I just talked to her on the phone a week or two earlier. And she said that she choked to death. And I think nobody should choke to death in a hospital. You know, there should be enough safety and involved in taking care of people, especially if they're mentally below their age. They should be watched a little bit better. That outsiders do die more often in hospitals. And this is the end. I'm checking here. So shout out to the people who are joining us. I'm happy that you're listening. And I'll continue with this story after Sterling. I went to a Mennonite college, and there's more black students there. As a matter of fact, my last year at Sterling, I said Sterling. I went to Bethel College. I left Sterling in town and went to Bethel College for my high school years in the early 1980s. And I remember meeting black students who'd come to play football in the city, and some of them were married now at that time, and I would work with them in the cafeteria where I was earning my money. As I said, I came from a relatively rich family, and so work study was my constant situation in my undergraduate days. And I remember them saying how wonderful it was to leave Florida, or some of them were Texas, and to be up here. They said it was such a trip to be in a place where they didn't have to worry about guns or violence. And the same thing was true for the people who were my roommates who'd fled South Africa or had come from Ethiopia or from Rhodesia, which was already Zimbabwe. As a matter of fact, my last year, as I was saying, my roommate was from Zimbabwe, and he was an amazing person. Shout out to Quiet Makube if you're listening. Um, um, at Bethel, I took some time off to study urban economics in Chicago at the Urban Life Center one January. While there, I visited several times Jesse Jackson's Operation Push, which seemed to me like a church, and it was taking place in an old church in Chicago. We went out and got voters registered for the election. That in January, or excuse me, in that winter, Harold Washington became the first black mayor and the only black mayor of Chicago in its history. And I'd still say Harold would be have been a better president than Barack Obama if he had had the opportunity. But that's another story. But I lived on the south side of Chicago and near South Shore. I lived in Woodlawn, which is north of the, excuse me, let me think about it, south of the University of Chicago. And we knew and learned at that time how Chicago had developed, how the war on poverty had been misused after its inception in the city to continue the urban renewal projects of the 1930s that had put all blacks in these big towers and caused stress and violence in the communities there. So I know how colleges and cities are related to one another and how neighborhoods, gentrification, whatever you call it, play their roles with stress for minority communities and who have made their homes there. And I think that experience always gave me a good perspective on working in the inner city. As a matter of fact, 2 years later, I came to Kansas City, Kansas, and did my teacher training with an organization called the Cooperative Urban Teacher Education Program. This program had been one of 12 programs created throughout the United States after 1967-68, when the cities of America were on fire, to help people from colleges all across the United States to come into urban areas and work with kids in school. So I taught at J.C. Harmon High School in around 1985, where I worked with a mix of students. And that was when I was doing my social studies teaching. So for one of the most interesting experiences you could have as a young teacher at that time, I was teaching American history to blacks, Hmongs, Latinos, people who have IEPs, who might have certain learning disabilities. And a woman she's a woman now, but as a high school student, she was probably 16. And it was for the first time I could tell she realized, well, that maybe her ancestors had intercourse with whites, and that was why she was the color she was. And it occurred to me how little education and discussion of history was going on at home for many people. And I'm glad, after being abroad, teaching in many countries over the last few years, I can come back to the States and I can see that there's more education. There's still not enough about the real history of the United States and abusive powers of whites over blacks, about the history of our Constitution, how it came to be, and how it hasn't been reformed like the people who wrote it expected it to be over the years. As a matter of fact, I taught the class by looking at the amendments to the Constitution as the framework of the class, and I asked them to see why were these amendments added. And each time, of course, it's because the certain decisions were put off at the time of the founding of the United States. And finally, when the Civil War came, in some cases, it took something like that to make the people sit down and change the Constitution to protect people, or to change the Constitution. So it usually took up quite a stressful situation like we're facing now with the pandemic, economic distress, racism, violence in America right now. It took some strong event like that to cause a change in the Constitution. And I hope that a lot more from rural areas or small towns like Secaucus, Missouri, will come to the cities and learn how to teach here. Now I'll continue my story. So I began to teach overseas after 1986. I taught in Germany, I taught in Japan, I taught in Nicaragua. I should add that living abroad was the first time I got to feel like a minority, and in some cases an abused minority. I was sometimes a privileged minority, and sometimes an abused minority. I remember walking through the streets of the tiny town I lived in Japan, Itoigawa, Japan, and hearing somebody shout from their window, Gaijin da. Gaijin means foreigner, da means there, but it's a term, pejorative term. Gaijin da. And I was just walking around with my white skin in Japan, and that was the kind of call somebody would make. Maybe they wanted to be friends. You just never know. They just hadn't been trained on how to communicate with people of different backgrounds or not. But I had the same thing in Germany. I knew some people in Europe were quite happy to have Americans visit them, but they did not want Americans to stay. And so one saw it in the relationships, the resistance to marriage. You saw it in the resistance to accept Americans for more than a short-term visit in the country while I was there. I'll continue on to when I returned to America and lived in Texas in 2000 through 2003 in College Station, Texas. And by this time, I'd been baptized as an adult. And I was in a pretty good church, one that I've continued to be in. But the fellowship in College Station was reflective of the university, maybe even a better reflection than you would get from most university school churches. We were quite mixed and very supportive relationships. But we were all, or many of them, I'll share my story with Levon to make this clear. Some Latinos, we had people from wealthier conservative backgrounds, Southern Texas backgrounds, all kinds of different people. And dating in the church was quite mixed race. People married and even in the church over the years. But I'll tell you about my friend Levon. Levon attended the church with us the whole 3 years I was there. He must have been there longer. As a matter of fact, he'd come to Texas A&M from his small town on the Louisiana border. Years earlier, and he'd worked in College Station ever since. Lived and worked there. But Levon had a secret, and the secret was why he was staying in College Station and why he was working at the DMV, the Department of Motor Vehicles, and another government agency in town. You see, Levon had got himself in trouble when he came to study at Texas A&M. He was a smart boy, but he'd come from a poor background and just didn't know. He had taken a check book that didn't belong to him and had used it to write some bad checks. And that was like his first year in college. The person whose checkbook it was had considered himself betrayed, and they went and prosecuted to the full. Levon. And 10 years later, Levon was still paying the price. He had, for $2,000 in bad checks he had written, or in fraudulent checks he'd written, he'd already paid the government some $10,000, in fees, parole fees, stuff like this. And Levon, in a fit of rage after 10 years of doing this and feeling like everything would just keep getting piled up on him. Oh, yeah, Levon is black. All right, let me make that clear. Levon is black. He had decided not to pay anymore. So one day Levon came in and he had this beeper on his leg. He had one of these electronic things tied to his leg. And it was at that point he had to share a story to me, and other people did know in the church about it. And then before I know it, Levon's calling me from jail. I went down to help him out. I learned how you could only visit the jail one day a week in that town. And Levon was there for about 2 months. I contacted on his behalf the lawyer. I contacted people in the courts, and the lawyer swore up and down, "Oh, Levon deserved it. Levon deserved it." And I said, "How can that be? For 10 years ago, yeah, the guy said he was guilty and he deserved it." It was obvious that this had been a wealthy lawyer who was a pro bono case, taking a bunch of pro bono cases, and he just negotiated an agreement. And this is the way things were running in Texas. It was being run like a make money system for the courts, for the police, for even the DMV, who could hire these people and then take out their money and pay the courts and fees and stuff. It was just an endless cycle. This poor Levon guy had not done any crime for 10 years, and he was still having to pay for it. And it was quite clear to me that this was wrong. And I thought that the lawyer should step in and do something on Levon's behalf. In any case, Levon got sent to state prisons eventually from the county prison or the city prison. I'm not sure which one it is, in College Station. And then Bryan, Texas. That was Bryan, Texas. College Station and Bryan grew into each other. And years later, I visited Levon in about 2006. I stopped by, and he was up in Wichita. He'd gotten out of prison the year before, and he was still going to the same type of fellowship up there and making a new life for himself. He wasn't going to live in College Station or Bryan anymore. But Levon noted to me that he said, "You're the only one. You're the only one who came to visit me while I was in prison." Okay, I thought about how wonderful my church was there, and I thought how sad it was that no one else had gone. I hadn't known that other people hadn't gone to visit Levon in prison. And you're the only one who wrote me letters in prison. It's just a thing I do. I like to write letters to encourage people. I'm writing and talking on the phone with a person in prison right now. I think as I summarize what I've talked to you about, my growing up and my experience in learning empathy and being an outsider or being picked on or being called a racist or by people or mistreated by people, and Americans who've been mistreated by a system, whether it's the courts, police, educational chances. I don't know if Harold Clark, who I met in Winsville, could have had a better school system if he was white. Because I definitely had my troubles in school, and I didn't do well until college. But I wish him the best, and I wish Levon the best, and I wish David the best, and I wish the Nichols family the best, and I pray that they're okay. But these are kind of things we need to inculcate in our community. We must be willing to go to the prisons. We must be able to get involved in with other communities. We must move in the neighborhoods where other people different than us are. We must be able to share joys and grow and love and make a difference in the system. Because America's not been perfect, and educators can make a difference by demanding that the education of our youth is become better. But in the same way, administrators must encourage teachers like me. I had to move abroad to find teaching most of the time outside the United States because um, the system was more into making certain powers to be happy than they were into making kids uh, more well-rounded and more resilient. That means letting them make mistakes, but also guiding them through the mistakes and teaching them how to work together as a community of mixed races to solve problems and to get along and to make the system better. We want better healthcare for our minority communities and for our wealthy people. We want better police system for our outsiders and our insiders. We want less violence in our country, and we want you to support us in this. I see Ima Vlog is there. Hi, Ima. Yeah, I hope you're enjoying what I've had to share today, and I hope you're doing okay, Ima Vlog. I'll say a shout out to you. Let's see who else is in there. Okay. So in summary, the church, I began this presentation today by saying that our church um, asked us to reflect on how to be involved in community, especially in the wake of the triple threats of pandemic, racism, and economic trauma. How can we help others? How can we help ourselves? How can we improve our relations to God at this time? Relationships to God and to each other at this time. And I've given you my story as a starting point. Please feel free to share yours and help me by telling me which parts of the story you'd like me to repeat or explain a little bit better, and which ones to leave out next time I tell this story. Because I might meet you in church or I might meet you in some corner of the world, and you can help me be a better communicator. And thank you for listening to my story about my journey through empathy, getting to know other people, making mistakes, um, the system's making mistakes, and recognizing and help us all to have a better next few years. All right. God bless you. Give me a thumbs up, and also subscribe to my vlog. And I hope you have a great day wherever you're at. Subscribe to the Kevin Stoddard blog. I YouTube it.